Welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs conference call series. My name is Corey Bender, Program Officer for Eurasia at IGE, and I will serve as the moderator on today's call. Thank you to everyone on the call. I hope that you will enjoy and engage in today's discussion. I would like to welcome our distinguished speaker for today's call, Dr. Martha Brill Olcott. Dr. Olcott has been a prolific author of works on all aspects of the political, social, and economic affairs in Central Asia and the geopolitical environment of the region for over 3 decades. While she's best known for her writings on Kazakhstan, Dr. Olcott has been studying questions of religion, identity, and politics in Central Asia and the Muslim world more generally for over 40 years. Her book, In the Whirlwind of Jihad, is the culmination of this research. Dr. Olcott is a visiting professor at Michigan State University. She's also professor emerita at Colgate University, where she served from 1975 to 2002. At various times in her career, Dr. Olcott has also served as a consultant or advisor for the U.S. government in various organizations. These include serving as special assistant to the Deputy Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburg, five-year term on the board of directors of the Central Asian American Enterprise Fund at the request of President Clinton. She also previously was the Senior Associate for Russia and Eurasia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before we start our conversation, I would like to provide a brief description of today's call format. I will begin with approximately half an hour of commentary from Dr. Olcott, and we will fill the remainder of the hour with questions from the audience. For the duration of the call, all participant lines will be placed on mute. If at any point during the call you have a question for Dr. Olcott, please press 5* and you will be placed in the queue. As a reminder, this call is on the record. Audio recording will be made available on our IGE website 24 hours after the call. Today's call is titled ISIS and the Changing Geopolitics of the Middle East. The recent attacks in Paris and Russia's growing military engagement in Syria could lead to a new strategic balance in the Middle East, impacting the balance of power within the region and reshaping the role of outside actors such as the EU and the U.S. Dr. Olcott will explore the possible medium and long-term impact of ISIS expanding global reach, Russia's growing engagement, Moscow's seeming partnership with Iran, and what this may mean for the relationship between religion and politics in the region and beyond. At this point, I would like to hand the call over to our speaker. Dr. Olcott, you have the floor.
Thank you, Julia. It's really a pleasure to have been asked to do this. I have to say that since we sent out the description, life has been so fluid that I'm going to shape my remarks slightly differently from what we said in the announcement. I would also like to add that on and off for the last 40 years I've been teaching politics, and that is what I've been doing the last 2 years at Michigan State University. So I've been living this drama, you can say, 24/7 to keep up with demands of my very engaged student body here. It seems to me I'm going to talk in 3 parts: a statement of the problem, some background information, and then what I would call collateral damage, which may come from the current situation and any international response in the region. First, let me start with a statement of the problem. Part of the reason I reshape my talk is that I really believe that the attacks in Paris on last Friday, on Friday the 13th, is really a game changer for what was already a fluid situation in the Middle East in general and the international campaign against ISIS. And I'm just going to call it ISIS because there are too many names for it floating around. And for me, at least, it raises the question of who is the cart and who is the horse. Are we, in fact, falling into a trap that has been set by ISIS? And I want to explore this as we go along. And I think this really has an impact on how we understand the military and geopolitical options that are before the U.S. and before its traditional allies and before anybody else who wants to sign on with us. What do the bombings in Paris signify? To me, Paris, to me at least, is another 9/11, at least symbolically, as I believe it was a strategic game changer by ISIS, and it leaves the question of whether or not it's really the tip of an iceberg. of a whole new strategy that ISIS is going to take. I mean, there were 3 major bomb scares called in yesterday. Or is this just a warning to us that a global strategy could come? And to me, the question that's out there is, will Paris bring a new global coalition to defeat terrorism that could be effective, or is it the international community being led to follow a game plan effectively dictated by ISIS and other international terrorist groups? Personally, for me, the idea of a new international global coalition makes me nervous, and I'm happy to explore that at much greater length, as it creates a focus on the shortest term risks, and doesn't deal with the underlying crisis in the Middle East, which is supporting and sustaining the belief that the West is the source of the region's problems, not to mention similar problems in other potential arenas of terrorism. As I said, that originally I was going to talk about Russia, and I think it's important to put Russia here on the table. Russia's position has changed in the last few weeks. Russia has supported the Assad regime from the very beginning, but before the bombings in Egypt, Russia had already announced what was effectively already an increase in its military presence, that it basically put the world on record that it wasn't going to keep Assad from being ousted, which had been their goal from the very beginning. And then after the sabotage of the plane in Egypt, then Moscow put itself forward, and again with the tragic loss of so many lives, as another victim in the whole struggle. So what I see is that in a few weeks, Putin has gone from near pariah status in the West due to Russia's policy in Ukraine to, it seems to me at least, to be on the verge of becoming a valuable partner, or a so-called valuable partner of the U.S. And at this very time, the situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine has grown less stable. So I think at minimum, and we can come back to this in questions if people are interested in it, at minimum, there is the question of what does participation in a global response by Russia or by any of the participants, and how should the value of what they're doing be evaluated? Related to that is the second part, whether Assad is going to stay in power, whether he's going to be able to stay in power, whether he will be viewed as the least of all evils as the international community focuses on ISIS rather than the civil war in Syria and focuses on trying to mop up. This was something that was a clear Russian goal at the onset and a clear Iranian goal. And I'll come back and talk some about Iran to the degree time allows later on. But unlike Iran, which I think is an interested actor by definition because of its location, Russia has inserted itself as an actor in this region. And here I think there is a clear tension between what has been at least the long-standing goal of the Obama administration, and I think a fair goal, that Assad really has to leave, that a solution that leaves him in power for anything but the shortest transition period is really unacceptable. For I think that there is a legitimate question as to whether Assad is, for all intents and purposes, an international war criminal because of his treatment of his own population, and how what was initially a fully peaceful protest was really turned into a very deep and ugly civil war. I think, and I'll just say a few things about ISIS itself, and I've sent along maps, and I'm always a sucker for maps because I think it explains so much. I mean, I think we shouldn't underestimate the problem of defeating ISIS militarily, how difficult that will be, as opposed to simply destroying some of ISIS's assets. I mean, ISIS has been largely self-supporting. I think the map that I've provided on the oil and gas structure makes that really clear. That, and through taxes and rents that they extract, has allowed them to put what in places is really a functioning government in place, and the maps I've given you show how much of the country is really under ISIS's control. And you see the range of bombing that has been done since September 30th by the coalition and by the Russians. And it's only in recent days that Russia was willing to turn its military actions from a broad attack on opponents of Assad to a seemingly more focused attack on ISIS-held assets. But even if we are able to basically the ISIS infrastructure of control without destroying all the people that are living in those areas, that's only the most visible part of the problem. I think it would really be naive to say that defeating this incarnation of an Islamic state or a terrorist Islamist movement is going to, in and of itself, prevent it from starting up in some muted or in some mutated form elsewhere, both in the Middle East and beyond. I think that the fluidity of its membership, and from Central Asia and Russia there are many thousand people participating, not to mention the people that we are now much more aware of coming from Europe, and not just coming from Europe, but how deeply integrated they've become in the military or the terrorist structure of ISIS itself, that they're not just, as a lot of the documentary evidence has come out previously has shown, they're not just fodder for the military campaigns in the region, but they're capable of participating and helping create military actions in other parts of the world, including right now, especially Europe. So I think that this is this is the first point that has to go on the table. But to me, even more seriously, is the fact that ISIS is the result of a festering and festered situation in the Middle East, which you can date back, if you like, to the Sykes-Picot Treaty at the end of World War I. But I think, like it or not, a much more immediate trigger was the U.S.-led coalition that invaded Iraq and the strategy for state building that was adopted there, combined with the conditions surrounding the withdrawal, the way withdrawal was achieved. So I view this as nonpartisan criticism. It's a criticism of both the Republican presidency and the Democratic presidency. And I fear that I don't see the international community willing, or most importantly able at this point economically, to attack this crisis in a meaningful way. If we start with the assumption that what the U.S. did was intended to be benign, and I think it really was, and intended to be positive, and intended to lead to state and political and economic development in Iraq that was positive and then would flower in neighboring countries, I don't see enough soul-searching and serious analysis of why this failed and how this could be done differently and better elsewhere. And that's, in a sense, what we're opening up as we open the whole Syrian question. And if you take away part of the conflict, the cause of the conflict, without identifying and trying to deal with the root causes, and I think we've bought ourselves a window of less terrorism in the short run, but we haven't addressed the deeper problems. Let me talk in the second section some about the roots of the conflict. I mean, again, I don't want to belabor this, but if you look at the first and second maps now, or some of the point that we sent out, map 1 shows the cultural mosaic of Syria and the region more generally, and map 2 shows the divisions after World War I. And so it's really clear that ethnic divisions were subsumed in large national states, which were then divided to suit the mandate holders. and to reward, and I'm not taking, a anti-imperialist view here. You can say it was done negatively, you can say it was done positively, but it still was done by the mandate holders to reflect their understanding of the political and economic realities on the ground. Best intentions or worst intentions. One doesn't have to assume that there were worst intentions for that being the case. We had seen, this wasn't the first outburst of what happens when ethno-communal power-sharing relationships break down. The civil war in Lebanon was in large part caused by this and had to be redefined, and it was redefined. And at the same time, you have the growth of the ferment within Islam that was made visible by the end of the Cold War confrontation. When socialism retreats, recedes, or disappears, it made whatever the existing ferment within, especially within Sunni Islam, because Shia Islam followed a different course through the Iranian Revolution, but it made contestations within the Islamic community much more important, because this was really where the ideological dynamism was. Iran versus Iraq, there had always been a Sunni-Shia undertone, and I think it's really important you have to put Iran on the table, as you do Turkey, when you talk about the Middle East and the instability and the civil wars and the challenges of state building in Iraq right now. Both Turkey, but especially Iran, is always going to be an interested party. Iran has always, and Iraq has always been not just Iran's backyard, but a source of its, Iran defines its basic identity in part in relationship, Iran under the Islamic State. Iran defines its identity in part in relationship to the Shia population in Iraq. And even before the Islamic State, there was an enormous fluidity between these two populations. So I think it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that Iran has been an interested actor throughout from 2003 on in particular. And I think one of the things that the U.S. had, U.S. policymakers didn't appreciate until after the fact, was the degree to which the Shia partners that the U.S. was using were very focused on Iran at the same time that they were working with us. It shouldn't be a surprise, and it shouldn't have been a shock. But Iran doesn't go away. The U.S. may come and go from the region. Russia may come and go. China may be trying to come. But Iran is just there. And they have been an interested party, and a party whose interests, I think, have to be at least understood for any hope of resolution and long-term stability in either of these countries, in either Syria or in Iraq, and with the Shia minorities that are under, or the Shia populations that are living in mixed Sunni Shia environments. So Bahrain would fit on that list as well in particular. But to go back to the Sunni-Shia tension, I think that that the communal, I mean, I've been impressed by how much I've read that argues that this Sunni-Shia tension in Iran could have been, in Iraq, could have been handled differently. I think that it was exacerbated during the aftermath of the coalition invasion of Iraq. And what I think Americans have to accept, that a large proportion of the Iraqi population viewed as an American occupation. The Sunnis more than the Shia, but the occupation was understood by the Sunni population as favoring the Shia and the Kurds. And while the surge squelched a lot of sectarian violence, the end of the surge and the U.S. withdrawal was not supported, was not accompanied by, it was supported, but it was not accompanied by a widely supported political solution in Iraq, and it certainly wasn't supported by a national security force that was competent that was itself seen by the population as nonpartisan and competent to deal with the sectarian rifts within the country. Then, and this is kind of the last point I want to make about roots, it was because of the situation in Iraq. It was quite a natural thing when the failed protests in Syria, peaceful protests, failed to create the environment of an Arab Spring that led to the ouster of Assad. And when that became morphed into armed opposition to Assad, it was quite natural for these Sunni groups in particular to morph with the militarized groups in Iraq, to morph both among the Sunnis and among the Shia. And here I think it's important to point to the difference between the Sunni and the Shia groups, and that the Sunni groups in particular have suffered from much greater fragmentation. And that is part of the reason why ISIS was able to gain such strength, that small Sunni groups coalesce with varying degrees of success, including, and they had very differing agendas. And here's where, the question of the role of secular groups has to be put on the table, because because secular groups have been not fully pushed out, but the secular-oriented message has become fainter and fainter in Syria as the civil war has moved forward. And if there were a defeat of ISIS, if it was to disappear as a factor, you still have the fact that, like in Iraq in 2004, 2005, you have no social and political consensus now, except that most of the population, or a large part of the population, would like to see Assad gone. And those who support him want to see their rights protected in any solution that doesn't include Assad. Let me turn to the next thing, the last section of my talk, which is about collateral damage of what's going on now in the region, the talk of an international coalition growing. The fact that something is going to happen, even if people can't define what they're going to do. I'd like to talk about, first, the question of any military action in the region is going to lead to more refugees, and refugees are going to be difficult to resettle. We've seen over the last 24 hours, last 3 days, that 26 U.S. governors have gone on record as saying they don't want Syrian refugees placed in their states. It's not clear they can all legally prevent it, but it really speaks to a real reluctance here to take refugees. Certainly the Europeans, there had been an outcry against this before. This is not going to make the question of settling refugees within Europe any easier. It will make it much, much harder. It's been well documented, a humanitarian crisis in the region, obviously, and now increasingly in Europe as well. And the refugee problem within Syria is only going to increase in a period of increased military engagement in the region. The second thing that makes me nervous is this notion of empowering dictators. I fear that Assad is going to be with us for a while, and that the kind of things he did to his own population will go unpunished, save for all the millions of people whose lives were really adversely affected by this, in ways that are horrific to contemplate. And from the point of view of Russia, this really does, I think, empower Putin and empower his view of global relations. And he's made no secret of the fact, and this has been well covered in the Russian press, about how, Syria is proof that democracy building is wrong, that the West really shouldn't intervene in these kind of ways and places, that dictatorships are more suitable, or managed democracy, or eternally managed democracy. And so I think that it is, if we're talking about long-term perception of the West and much of the world, I think it really is a very, potentially very bad situation. The penultimate set of points is about religious engineering, the whole question of who is a good Muslim and who is a bad Muslim. There's talk of the statements that have come out in the U.S. and statements that have come out in Europe that this all has to be combined with some form of reformation of Islam. I've been studying Islam since graduate school in the early 1970s, and I finally feel confident that I know enough to know that I will never be able to call myself an expert on Islamic theology. That said, I know enough to say that a group of secular actors, including secular Muslims, and we can talk about what a secular Muslim is, are not in a position to engage in an Islamic reformation project for Sunni Islam. I mean, we have to talk about Shia Islam separately. These are Sunni Islamic movements that are behind ISIS. And when secular states with Muslim majorities try to do this, they're courting disaster. And if I can leave you with a penultimate thought, I think, and this is one of the things that has been brought home to me in so much of the really great literature that's come out about the Middle East post 2011 and the Arab Spring, we see in the countries even there that are Muslim majority countries and that we Americans always think of as religious Muslim majority countries, that in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, and even in Saudi Arabia, which itself is a highly conservative Sunni Islamic society, there's an enormous continuum of voices among Islamic clerics that range from those who ally themselves directly with the state and accept the state's political and economic goods that this alliance gives them, and those who embrace violence to overthrow the state because of the state, what in their mind is the state's unacceptable view of Islam, its unwillingness to put Islam at the core of the state policy. And in this continuum, the vast majority of clerics who object to the state, who object to the state's empowerment of certain clerics, are themselves not interested in endorsing any sort of violent version of Islam. They're just trying through peaceful means to get the state to embrace Islam more fully or more in tune to their understanding of Sunni Islam. And so virtually anybody, external actor, be he from the state itself and even worse from outside of the state, that decides to choose among whose vision is really running an enormous risk that much of Sunni Islam will turn against that vision. I mean, to me, and this is what I write about in my book about Islam in Central Asia, but I think it's really a truth about Sunni Islam everywhere, it has to be an internal dynamic in each of these countries within Islam, defining what is and isn't an understanding of Sunni Islam that is doctrinally acceptable to the population and culturally acceptable to the population. But there's no clear hierarchy in Sunni Islam, and you can say this view has to prevail. And this is what makes the question of taking sides on these questions and dealing with the question of defeating terrorism on ideological grounds such a risky strategy, as opposed to dealing with security threats. My last comments really are about security threats and the concern of the loss of civil rights in democratic societies. I mean, as we deal with the security risks that are posed by what's, I think, clearly a new stage in terrorism and the focus on the West in terrorism, I think we have to decide what kinds of civil rights we're willing to sacrifice and whose civil rights. There's now serious talk in France of making constitutional changes to deal with dual nationals and potentially strip those under suspicion of their French nationality. People feared, that the question of, some of these terrorists in France were natural-born French citizens. Is it going to be acceptable to, in not just France, but anywhere that one goes looking for people who are terrorist risks, is it going to be acceptable to risk sending innocent people to jail to try to get the guilty arrested? Is it okay if you thwarted a terrorist act that 10 people were arrested and only 2 of them actually seem to have had terrorist ties? One of the most disturbing things about the Paris attacks to me is that many of those people who, of the 7 who they identified that were responsible, were already on watch lists and hadn't been arrested. And at first I thought, well, this is really terrible. It means you don't know who's really a threat to the state. But then, and this is really my concluding thought, it raises the civil rights issue. We have to set a threshold that makes people feel secure, but doesn't so eviscerate the democratic values that all our states are built on. And so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Olcott, for your presentation. We will now open the lines for questions from the audience. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please press 5*. When it is your turn to ask your question, the call administrator will announce your name and so that you may ask it. Lines will be placed on mute following the asking of a question. If your question has been asked or you no longer wish to ask your question, please press 5* again, and your name will be erased from the queue. For the sake of other callers, I will ask that when you are called upon, immediately answer the question rather than providing your own commentary.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Olcott. Our first question today comes from Julie Scheimer. Julie, your line has been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. It was great to hear your commentary. My question is, early on you said that that if we don't get to the root of the issue, and I mean we like the world don't get to the root of the issue
right,
which caused this violence, that security solutions aren't likely to resolve it. Could you say a little bit more about what that root is? Obviously you don't think it's trying to modify Islam or create an Islamic view from outside. So what can we as Western nations do, or is there nothing we can do other than security?
Well, I think it depends. I think it's a really good question, and I certainly think about it a lot. To me, it's how much money we want to spend and how much we want to engage on the ground. Or else I think we're stuck just with security solutions. If we go in and succeed in bombing most of the ISIS strongholds, and we don't have a plan and a commitment to help fund a plan that will create a stable state in Syria, then, I see you're going to continue to have incubators in the Syria-Iraq corridor of terror going forward in the future. I don't see these people as becoming less heroic if we've defeated them. I have to say, I'm struck by the incompleteness of what we did in Iraq, and that anything that the West plans, it has to really think through what withdrawal, and I don't mean just military, but just like withdrawal of our pocketbooks as well, is going to do, and whether the strategies we have on the ground are acceptable to the populations of the area. Certainly Afghanistan becomes, belongs in this talk, another area where where problems are pending. The good thing from the West is it's unlikely to be as exported to the West as it is being from the Middle East. But these are areas of, that do not have stable. So we have Libya that doesn't have a functioning government. So I think we've kind of closed our eyes is the wrong thing, but we have not been willing to see through the magnitude of the problems that we helped move forward on the agenda. We didn't create them, but we moved them up in terms of the likelihood of their being, them needing immediate attention.
Thank you, Dr. Alcott. Our next question comes from Mona Malik with Assyrian Aid Society. Mona, please ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Alcott. My question is regarding the changing geopolitics part of your discussion. Where do you see the KRG and the Kurds, where their role is in the changing geopolitics?
Again, I treat them as an internal actor. I mean, any solution, I don't know how to answer the question because it seems to me it has two parts. I mean, the presence of the Kurdish population in the region divided across the three countries creates a role, makes Turkey by definition an interested actor in whatever is going to develop. And at the same time, the Kurdish population is indigenous to the region itself, and it has to be accommodated in any solution. In Iraq, the Kurdish regions are the most stable regions. And in Syria, the Kurdish population is playing, has a different, doesn't have the same political, it may have the same political stake, but it doesn't have the same structural solutions already on the table for it. So I go back to my mosaic. It's part of the populations that need to be accommodated in any solution and need to have their rights protected. But because the Kurdish population is a trigger for Turkey, a focal point for Turkey, in Syria, its role in Syria is different than how one relates to it in Iraq, where it already has a strong political, institutional solution. So I don't see them as a geopolitical factor. I see them as part of the internal dynamics and groups that have to be accommodated.
All right, thank you. And it looks like Mona has a follow-up question. So Mona, go ahead and follow up.
Dr. Alcott, the reason I ask is because they're not just part of the region, they are a power in the region, in the north, northern Iraq. And the reason I ask is because recently there has been evidence collected, primary source evidence, and witnesses verifying that the Peshmerga, the KRG, disarmed Assyrians and Yazidis 2.5 weeks before the advance of ISIS. And we have to take this into accountability here because they are in power and we are looking at them as our allies, yet they did empower ISIS by disarming the minorities there. So the accountability of the Peshmerga and the successful ethnic cleansing of the Nineveh Plain has to be considered. That's why I brought it up, and I'm just wondering if, because you did mention that empowering dictators like Assad and Putin, and you only mentioned those two, when in fact the Iraqi central government and the KRG are taking advantage of the situation and persecuting the minorities there. There are videos of Yazidis who were on Sinjar and asked the Peshmerga when they left them for ISIS to be slaughtered. When they asked them, why are you leaving? They said, we are leaving to have more power, more help to come fight ISIS. Well, some of the Yazidis went with them, and they were actually killed by the Kurds on the way. So I just think we have to look at them as not just a group that needs to be aided as well, but I think they're part of the problem. I would be interested.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
Okay, I think that I think it's a really important point that you make, and I think it raises even more challenge for us all. I put Assad in a separate category simply because he was head of state when he did this. This was his response to a set of peaceful demonstrations. So I see him as a trigger, and that is. I'm not saying he's the only person who has carried out ethnic cleansing in the area. I think it's horrific, the toll of ethnic cleansing that's been carried out in Syria by a variety of forces, and in Iraq in various periods in the last 15 years. And I don't know how the international community responds to that. Because there have to be internal governments in these countries that begin picking up the pieces of this, or else there has to be international occupation for the next 10 or 20 years. And I don't see anybody I don't see the latter at all, and I don't see the former as moving forward really either, which is part of the reason why I think the situation is so, why people are going to just settle for security solutions that work in their own, to protect their own countries. I don't know that my pessimism is helpful. And I'd certainly be interested in hearing what Mona has to say in response if there isn't such a long line for questions. Because I certainly am not putting myself forward as, having a strategy that people should adopt.
There are currently no questions in the queue, so Mona, if you'll go ahead and continue the dialogue.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, one of the options that has been on the table, and we all support as an Assyrian community, Yazidis, and other minorities, and that is an internationally protected zone in the Nineveh Plain, where it allows all indigenous people and Sunnis and Shiites who are willing to live in peace. And it has to be in an internationally protected zone and nothing else, a no-fly zone, sort of what was set up for the Kurds in the north. And the only way to do it is to have boots on the ground internationally. So once they're there, they can protect that zone and then be able to exterminate ISIS. And yes, you're right that we have to be there for a long time for that area to become stable.
But if I can ask you, and I agree with you, and I certainly support the zone that you're talking about and have read about it and know about it. I was trying to answer at the next level of sort of state building. Do you see Assad staying then as acceptable in the medium term?
That's a tough one.
I mean, I put you on the spot. I mean, you can.
Yeah, Syria as a whole, to me, is a whole other problem that I think is beyond my, capability to comment on. But I'm just talking about in the Iraq area, we have an opportunity where there are a majority of minorities, which are Assyrians and Yazidis, in the Nineveh Plain, where it's a good start. It's a good starting point for us to develop this area. If we are really, truly, honestly, sincerely interested in keeping the indigenous people, the Assyrian Christians, the Yazidis, and Sabian Mandayans and others, this is the only solution. Otherwise, get them out of there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with you. I'm really thankful that you brought this up because I think it's really critical. Because, and that's something that I, should have included in the talk. It's like one of the things that frightens me now is that our focus is going to be internationally. It's going to be, we're refocusing on our own sense of fear and grief, and not focusing on the plight of the people in this area.
Right, and I think engaging the minorities is really important. Just look at the $500 million that was invested in Syria to the wrong people, or to who we thought were, the correct rebels, right?
It's horrifying.
In Iraq, yeah. So we really can't do the same, have the same thing happen in Iraq. And I know that's why we're a little, sorry to use the term gun shy here, but I think we need to engage the minorities directly. The Yazidis and the Assyrians are ones that I think that are being ignored. And again, we are left in the hands of two very corrupt governments, the central government and the KRG.
No, I'm really glad that you brought this up because it's really important.
All right, thank you. We also had a question that was emailed in. So I would want Dr. Alcott, could you just answer, so will these developments force the U.S. and the EU to take pressure off human rights issues in Central Asia?
I think that what concerns me is that I'm trying to think of how to put it, that it's going to change the focus from human rights to security and security cooperation. And the issue in Central Asia, I would argue, is not simply to I think that what we need to do is begin to think creatively about how can we advance a human rights agenda in a way that makes it both more palatable to these governments through helping them understand that they're not advancing security in the short term or in the medium term or the long term by short-term efforts to limit human rights on questions of freedom of conscience in particular. And this goes back to my penultimate point about religious engineering, that talking about using human rights restrictions to engage in religious engineering, I think, is a strategy that creates security unrest. Really increases the likelihood of security threats. And so I think that it's inevitable that our attention to human rights will be in part reshaped through the focus of security, but we have to be, I think, really cognizant of the fact that security has to be understood in a much broader term.
Well, Martha, This is a very interesting call, and being the Eurasia Program Officer, I'd like to close with a question about Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know, Russia is clearly using this intervention to distract from Ukraine, and I think the Paris attacks are really making that possible. Are the developments in the region going to make it easier for Russia to act as it pleases in its near abroad?
Thank you for that question, because I think I really am concerned that it will. And that's what I was alluding to in the beginning when I talked about, that we've gone from him being a near pariah to him becoming a potential valued ally. So I think that these bigger issues, as they did after September 11th, of looking for partnerships and getting everybody on board, there's a risk that we'll try the same kind of strategy again. And that will really empower Putin in his what he sees as his own rightful backyard. And it will make it harder, I think, for the U.S. to be able it won't make it harder to criticize, it just will make the U.S. more reluctant to criticize, because on the list of key strategic priorities of the U.S., these questions will be pushed down to some degree. The U.S. has tried to signal, the importance of Central Asia by Kerry's trip a few weeks ago, going for the first time on a single trip of the Secretary of State to all 5 countries. But how will this be sustained in the long run? And how will the U.S. sustain it, especially with the question of diversion of even more resources, which I think inevitably will have to go towards the Middle East area. And we haven't talked about Afghanistan today, and I really think that has to be on the table when we talk about security. The security situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating. And that's going to get on the agenda even faster than the situation in Central Asia. And Putin is using the security situation and the risks posed by Afghanistan, potential risks, to really increase Russia's presence in at least the security decision-making process in Central Asia. And will continue to press for more Russian boots or pro-Russian boots on the ground in this region. This is an area where I think, as Putin has his global resurgence, he's going to try to press for a recognition of Russia's special role, especially since there's no evidence at all that the U.S. is going to be willing to substantially increase its role in that region, in Afghanistan. Talk and engagement with Central Asia is relatively cheap, but I'm not saying that nastily at all. It's because it's not an area which is making a demand for large U.S. resources to solve any problems right now. But for the U.S. to engage in a meaningful way in Afghanistan, it would be a great deal of resources. And that's where I see Russia saying, well, you just have to kind of put up with what we're doing in Ukraine, never ever saying it straight out, but assuming that that is the understanding if you want us to help secure these borders with Afghanistan.
Well, Dr. Olcott, thank you for this engaging and insightful conversation, and thank you to our callers for joining us today. I hope you'll join us again in our next Faith and International Affairs conference call on December 17th, which will feature Knox Thames, the State Department's Special Advisor for Religious Minorities in the Near East and South and Central Asia. We welcome any and all suggestions for topics and speakers that you would like to hear in the future on our Faith and International Affairs conference call series. Please feel free to submit any recommendations the same way that you RSVP'd for this call. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.